Here we are at the cerebrum, the largest part of the human brain. The cerebrum is highly developed in humans and allows us to perform several functions such as reading, writing, and speaking, and other forms of communication, and the ability to interpret what others are communicating to us. The cerebrum is where we perform higher functions such as calculating, making judgments. Our behavior is regulated by the cerebrum. The cerebrum is responsible for the ability to plan, imagine, to have abstract thoughts, to remember, and to create. And the cerebrum is where we process input from the five senses. The cerebrum anatomically consists of the outer gray matter shell called the cerebral cortex, commonly referred to simply as the cortex, which surrounds a deeper white region consisting of myelinated axons bundled into tracts. Within the white matter, we have clusters of gray matter called the basal nuclei, which again are involved in regulating and starting and stopping movements. We're going to tie all the areas of the brain that are related to movement together towards the end. The cerebrum is highly convoluted, consisting of several rolls and folds that fold up to increase the surface area and the volume of the brain and allows it to fit within the cranial cavity. The ridges or the folds are called gyri. One is called a gyrus. And the grooves between the folds are called fissures if they're deep, or sulci or sulci if they are shallow. A single groove is called a sulcus, S-U-L-C-U-S. The major markings around the cerebrum are formed by fissures and sulci. These include the longitudinal fissure, which again is that deep groove that lies between the right and left halves of the cerebrum. This is the fissure into which the falx cerebri extends as one of the dural folds. As we look at the diagrams of the cerebrum, we'll meet some of the other major markings. The cerebrum, again, contains bands of white matter. A major one is the corpus callosum, very visible as it's cut in a lateral view of the cerebrum. That's that thick band of tissue that lies just superior to the diencephalon. So the corpus callosum is a band of axons that form a commissure that connect the left and right halves of the hemispheres. The left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum, to say it properly. Each hemisphere has 4 lobes on the surface that are named for the bones that cover them. So these lobes are easy to label on a diagram, hint, hint, because they lie just below the bones for which they are named. They are the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. To give you an overview, the frontal lobe is responsible for your higher functions such as thinking and calculating, judging, and regulation of behavior. It is also the lobe that contains your motor areas, the areas that control skeletal muscle function. The parietal lobe, which lies posterior to it, is a major sensory area receiving input for touch, pressure, proprioception, pain, and taste. The temporal lobe is sensory for hearing or audition, A-U-D-I-T-I-O-N, and the occipital lobe is sensory for vision. In this diagram on the right, we have a superior view looking down at the brain. You can see the very prominent longitudinal fissure that separates the left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum. Also running horizontally, you can see the central sulcus. This is a shallow groove that separates the anterior frontal lobe from the more posterior parietal lobe. On the diagram to the left, we have a cutout of the cerebrum that shows you the convoluted surface that includes the gyri and the sulci, and here we have the deep longitudinal fissure. This cutout also shows you the superficial gray matter, which surrounds the deeper white matter. And here we have the largest part of the brain, the cerebrum. This diagram is very important. It will be on your test. Please note all the labels, including the brain areas and the markings that separate the brain areas, but also be able to map to each area its function. So let's look at the lobes. Each lobe is named for the bone that covers it. We have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe in blue, occipital lobe in green, and the temporal lobe in this pinky purplish color. Now you need to know these lobes by location, not by color, just in case you have to identify them in black or white, or I don't know, in a client on a surgery table. The frontal lobe is separated from the parietal lobe by a major landmark called the central sulcus. So the central sulcus is the groove that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Separating the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe is a parieto-occipital sulcus, and separating the temporal lobe from the more superior parietal and frontal lobe is the lateral sulcus. All right, so the main sulci are the lateral sulcus, the central sulcus, and the parieto-occipital sulcus. Also note the transverse fissure. It is a deep groove that separates the cerebrum from the more inferior cerebellum. This is the groove into which the tentorium cerebelli, that dural extension, reaches or is found. So the tentorium cerebelli lies within the transverse fissure between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Now, within the frontal lobe, an important ridge lies just anterior to the central sulcus. This is called the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus contains the nuclei that send signals eventually to your skeletal muscles for voluntary control and is responsible for initiating skeletal muscle activity. Therefore, functionally, this area is called the primary motor cortex. Posterior to it and behind the central sulcus is a corresponding region called the postcentral gyrus in the parietal lobe. It receives incoming sensory information for all your somatic senses. So the precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe is responsible for somatic control or skeletal muscle control, while the postcentral gyrus in the parietal lobe receives incoming sensory information from your muscles as well as your other somatic senses, including those in the skin for pain, temperature, touch, pressure, itching, tickling, vibration, you name it. If it's associated with skin or skeletal muscles, it projects to the postcentral gyrus, which is then functionally called the primary somatosensory area or region. Behind it, you have the somatosensory association area in the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe is your primary region for vision, so it contains a primary visual area, and your temporal lobe contains your primary auditory region. In the frontal lobe, we not only have your primary motor area, but we also have the areas that are responsible for cognition, intelligence, and behavior in the prefrontal region. We have the areas that are responsible for coordinating muscle activity, especially repeated muscle activity in the premotor area. We have the frontal eye field, which is responsible for the ability to read text on a page and to follow script. We're going to look at these functional areas in another diagram, but again, you need to be able to map them to these regions on this diagram. All right, so some notes here on the areas we just looked at on the cerebral diagram. So the central sulcus again separates the frontal and parietal lobes. That precentral gyrus located anterior to the central sulcus contains a primary motor area which is responsible for initiating skeletal muscle activity or controlling skeletal muscle activity. It receives signals from the cerebellum and from the basal nuclei and other brain areas, but it is the area, the primary motor area is the area that initiates skeletal muscle signals. Posterior to it in the parietal lobe is the postcentral gyrus that receives all coming somatic sensory input and therefore is called the primary somatosensory area or cortex. It's receiving signals for pain, temperature, touch, pressure, proprioception. At the base of the postcentral gyrus, we also have the sensory area for taste or your primary gustatory area. These gray areas communicate via white matter tracts or cerebral white matter. The tracts have three potential orientations. So if the tracts communicate between the left and right halves of the hemispheres, they are called commissural tracts, and they include the large corpus callosum, as well as anterior and posterior commissures, in addition to others. So again, commissural tracts run between and connect the two hemispheres. Association tracts run perpendicular to commissural tracts and communicate within the same hemisphere. So you can imagine those as running anterior to posterior, while the commissural tracts run left to right. And now communicating superior to inferior are the projection tracts. These include the large pyramidal tracts that run through the spinal cord and project up towards the cerebrum, and also include the corticospinal tracts that begin up in the cerebral cortex in that primary motor area and take signals down through the brainstem into the spinal cord. Here's a diagram showing you some of these. You can see the large corpus callosum deep in the cerebrum. So this is cut. And again, it communicates between the left and right hemispheres. You can see other commissural and projection tracts in the superior part of the cerebrum, as well as your anterior commissures and association tracts. Here are the basal nuclei that we mentioned back when we were talking about the midbrain and the substantia nigra. So there are three clusters of cell bodies that make up these deep nuclei within each cerebral hemisphere, and they are properly called basal nuclei, but some textbooks get it wrong and calls them basal ganglia. Don't get confused. Their names are the globus pallidus, the putamen, and the caudate nucleus. You do not need to know those names, but you should recognize them. The purpose of the basal nuclei, in a nutshell, is to help initiate and terminate movements so that they are smooth. The basal nuclei also help to suppress unwanted movements and help to regulate muscle tone. However, signals to skeletal muscles, again, are initiated from the primary motor areas in the precentral gyrus. The basal nuclei send signals to the primary motor area through the thalamus or via the thalamus, but again, the primary motor area is what initiates those signals with help from the basal nuclei and the cerebellum. So here is a location of the basal nuclei. You can see that they lie just lateral to the thalamus and the ventricles. And again, via the thalamus, they send signals to the primary motor area to help smooth out and coordinate movements. Before we move on and look at the other cerebral areas, let's pause and discuss the limbic system. The limbic system is not a distinct anatomical area in the brain, but is made up of different brain areas that work together to form your emotional brain. So it allows you to experience and respond to emotional experiences. The limbic system consists of several areas deep in the cerebrum, including the cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus, the dentate gyrus, the amygdala, and areas in the diencephalon, including the mammillary bodies, the thalamus, parts of the hypothalamus, and the bundle of neurons that make up the olfactory bulb. So again, your sense of smell is tightly related to emotion because many of the signals for smell project directly to parts of the limbic system. Again, olfaction is the only sense that does not pass through the thalamus on its way to parts of the cerebrum and limbic system. The limbic system is tightly tied to olfaction and memory. So your sense of smell triggers memories and also emotional responses because they're all anatomically connected. So here are some of the structures. We didn't bother to label them here. They're kind of complicated to identify, but they're located deeper in the cerebrum and also include parts of the diencephalon, including the thalamus, hypothalamus, and parts of the epithalamus. Here we will consider the various functions of the parts of the limbic system. So in a nutshell, the amygdala is associated with fear and anger, two emotions which are tightly associated. If we're really afraid, that can trigger anger, or a sense of anger can trigger fear. Those emotions are sometimes hard to separate. Now, the amygdala also allows one to recognize fearful expressions in others while allowing that same individual to express their own fear and rage. So think of the amygdala as your angry, fearful center. The hippocampus, along with the amygdala, are also involved in long-term memory. Now, when it comes to emotion, sometimes it doesn't make sense. And there are triggers that can elicit emotional responses that we sometimes can't explain. Often that is due to the fact that certain experiences that are stored in our long-term memory trigger the emotions associated with those experiences. We mentioned that the limbic system also includes the olfactory bulb, so our sense of smell can definitely affect our emotions. Some smells remind us of individuals that we like, others remind us of memories that are painful or unpleasant and can take us right back to those experiences no matter how many years ago they occurred. The hypothalamus is part of the limbic system. It allows us to experience anger or rage, fear. Signals for pain also project to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, again, also contains the centers associated with libido or sexual arousal, pleasure, as well as our state of alertness. So all together, the connection between these emotions and experiences and the hypothalamus result in a physiological response to emotions, as well as pain. Pain sometimes triggers anger and fear. They're all connected. And when we experience pain, we often sweat and our heart rate goes up, again, because the hypothalamus as part of the limbic system, receiving these pain signals also controls the physiological or autonomic expressions or responses. Finally, it's important to note that the limbic system also communicates and forms connections to the prefrontal cortex, located at the tip of the frontal lobe, and this area of the brain is responsible for regulating behavior. It's your thinking part of the brain, your cognitive brain. So the fact that your more developed cognitive brain is connected to your less developed and primitive emotional brain means that there's an interplay between thoughts, logic, emotions, and behavior. Thankfully, this connection also allows us to have conscious control over our emotional expressions so that we do not act out of sorts or inappropriately during emotional responses. I wish I was in class with you to describe this, but suffice to say, for example, you see a person and you have a romantic attraction to them. Your prefrontal cortex, your cognitive brain, is what controls you and prevents you from maybe jumping on that person and expressing those romantic emotions, because that's not socially acceptable. We're not animals here. All right. The connection between your prefrontal cortex and your limbic system allows you not to have excessively emotional outbursts, even though you might be feeling the need for that internally. The prefrontal cortex is trained over time and also by your experiences. Here we return to the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. We will begin by looking at the sensory areas. The primary somatosensory area, again, is located on the post-central gyrus in the parietal lobe just behind the central sulcus. The primary somatosensory area in each hemisphere receives sensory input regarding touch, pressure, proprioception, vibration, temperature, pain. All the somatic sensory stimuli are sent to one half of the cerebral cortex from the opposite side of the body due to decussation of the tracts that bring that information up towards the brain. So remember that phenomenon of decussation or crossing over is responsible for contralateral sensory perception. Also note that the primary somatosensory area allows you to localize the source of those sensations. So depending on which part of the somatosensory area is activated, the brain can determine where those signals are coming from in the body. This is based on the mapping of the brain where the more superior parts of the somatosensory area correlate with the lower parts of the body, and the more lateral and inferior parts of the cortex here correlate with the upper parts of the body. Also note that more area in the primary somatosensory cortex is devoted to areas of the body that are more sensitive or have more receptors. So the tips of the fingers, the face, and the lips, those send signals to a larger area in the primary somatosensory area because of their increased sensations. Moving along, the primary visual area is located at the tip of the occipital lobe. So signals coming in along cranial nerves 2 project and send signals via the thalamus to the primary visual area located at the tip of the occipital lobe. Your hearing sensations are sent to the upper ridges of the temporal lobe. So your temporal lobe contains what's called your primary auditory area or cortex. As I mentioned, the primary gustatory area is at the base of the post-central gyrus in the parietal lobe. And your primary olfactory area is also located in the temporal lobe, but note that signals for olfaction are sent to several areas of the brain. Be able to locate these areas on our diagram of the cerebrum, the lateral view of the diagram. Within the cerebrum, we have several functional areas which map to specific anatomical regions within the cerebrum. Wernicke's area is located on the superior ridges of the temporal lobe and spread into the parietal lobe, the inferior parietal lobe. And this is a major language area that is responsible for language comprehension and use, the ability to sound out words, the ability to associate particular sounds with letters and combinations of letters. Wernicke's area allows you to understand questions and respond appropriately. Broca's area, however, is located in the frontal lobe at the base of the precentral gyrus. This language area is responsible for controlling the motor aspects of speech, the ability to create sounds that are audible and understandable, the ability to communicate what one wants to say, not only through speech, but also through writing. Damage to Wernicke's area results in an individual who can babble and make sounds, but they have no meaning, or the words are strung together and don't make any sense. Damage to Wernicke's area also results in an inability to understand questions. So if someone asks me, Lorraine, how are you doing? Damage to Wernicke's area might sound like this. My gracious, look at that spot on the far dog. Blah, blah. Totally nonsensical, incomprehensible, because the individual is not understanding language and cannot use it properly. With damage to Broca's area, if you said, Lorraine, how you doing? I may not be able to respond to you because I would have lost control of the motor aspects of speech. So I know what I want to say, I can't say it. Can't get the words out, or with slight damage, it might take longer to string the words together or find words, as it's often said. The prefrontal area is a large area at the front of the frontal lobe, and it is responsible for your higher functions such as comprehension, calculations, intelligence, judgment, behavior. This area is trained over time with experience and socialization. And this area is also the one that is connected to the limbic system so that we can control ourselves and regulate our behavior and determine which reactions are appropriate and inappropriate. The premotor area, also located in the frontal lobe, is anterior to the primary motor area just above the prefrontal area. This area is responsible for learned complex motor activities, repetitive actions, where your muscles know what to do with training over time. Things like being able to type your password without even thinking about it, or to play an instrument, to ride a bike. Remember, they say you never forget. That training of neurons that control the muscles associated with those activities occurs in the premotor area. Also in the frontal lobe is the frontal eye field, and that's the area that allows you to follow lines when you're reading and skip down to the next line and read from left to right, or for some right to left. But that area is also trained over time and allows you to follow text on a page or on a screen. So this is a diagram that maps these functional areas to the various anatomical regions of the brain. Why don't you put this map beside the one of the cerebral lobes and then compare so that you know that the occipital lobe contains your primary visual area, temporal lobe, primary auditory. Your Wernicke's is spread across the superior temporal lobe and your parietal lobe. There's Broca's, which is labeled number 44 at the base of the precentral gyrus. Okay, there's number 10, which is your prefrontal cortex. Number 8 is the frontal eye field that I just described. And number 6 would be your premotor area, etc. There's the primary gustatory area around number 43 at the base of the post-central gyrus, in the parietal lobe. And now I'm going to go through some of the other areas, which are the association areas for these regions. Related to the primary sensory areas, we have association areas that interpret and create memories, as well as pull-up memories associated with sensations. For example, the somatosensory association area located in the parietal lobe, just posterior to the primary somatic sensory area, allows us to interpret the sensations coming into that area. So is this an intense pain or mild pain? It also creates memories and associates those incoming signals with memories so that we can further interpret the stimuli. I remember when this happened to me before, when I felt this before. Of course, your brain isn't saying all that, but it's making those connections. So it interprets and pulls up and creates memories related to somatic sensory information. Similarly, the visual association area in the occipital lobe, just anterior to the primary visual area at the tip, allows one to interpret what they are seeing and create memories associated with that. That allows you to recognize faces and places and to categorize what you're seeing based on your understanding of what things look like. Interpret that. Also, we have the auditory association area in the temporal lobe that allows us to make distinctions between speech, music, and noise, allows us to articulate between various sounds with respect to speech so that we can understand ka from sa and all the vowels and consonants, all the things that we hear and interpret that occurs in the auditory association area. Here is our prefrontal cortex that I described a bit in detail on a previous slide. So reading through this, again, this is the complex area that's highly developed in humans, allows us to show concern for others, judgment, behavior, allows us to think and plan and dream. Again, it's developed over time and trained with experiences and socialization. What you observe, your prefrontal cortex interprets that and stores that information to inform decision making and interpretation of future information. And finally, again, the prefrontal cortex is linked with the limbic so that we can regulate our emotions and also interpret our emotions, analyze our emotions, reflect on our emotional experiences. All right, finally, the last slide. This was a long unit. Hemispheric lateralization refers to the fact that although the cerebral hemispheres are anatomically symmetrical, functionally they are very different. The left half of your brain is stronger in certain functions compared to the right side. The left side in most individuals is stronger in the reasoning, scientific, and mathematical area, as well as the language area. Broca's area, Wernicke's area is definitely more developed on the left half of the cerebrum. This includes both spoken, written, and understood language. So again, Broca's and Wernicke's area. Of course, because of decussation, the left hemisphere also receives signals from the right side of the body, and the primary motor area in the left hemisphere controls the right half of the body. Compared to the right hemisphere, which controls and receives signals from the left half of the body, The right hemisphere is also stronger in the artistic areas, musical awareness, visual arts awareness, and appreciation and interpretation, as well as space and pattern perception and depth perception. This is the right half of your brain. It allows you to recognize faces and the emotional content of facial expressions and language and emotion in general. So the right side is your more artistic, emotional half, while your left half is your more scientific, mathematical, and language half. We encourage everybody to develop both halves of your cerebrum so that you are a well-rounded individual who can contribute to all areas of society. Thanks.